Entitled neighbor thinks my garden is a free buffet. So, I live in a small neighborhood where most people keep to themselves, except for my one neighbor, Karen. Yes, that's actually her name. She's notorious around here for thinking everything is her business. But recently, she took things to a whole new level. I have a small garden in my backyard where I grow tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and some herbs. It's a hobby, and I like the fresh produce during summer. One day, I came home to find Karen in my backyard, picking my tomatoes. No permission, no asking, just casually plucking them like she was at a farmer's market. What are you doing? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite my irritation. Oh, I'm just taking some tomatoes, she replied with a smile, not even remotely apologetic. You always have so many. It's not like you'll miss a few. I explained to her that while I do have a lot, I put time and effort into growing them, and they're not up for grabs without asking. She rolled her eyes and left, but not without mumbling something about how I was being selfish. I figured that would be the end of it. Oh, how wrong I was. The next morning, I found a note taped to my front door. It read, "Since you're clearly so greedy with your veggies, I've decided that I'll just take what I need when I need it. Don't bother being stingy." She signed it with a smiley face. A smiley face. I was fuming. I went over to her house, note in hand, and knocked on her door. She opened up with that same smug grin and acted like this whole situation was no big deal. When I told her to stop coming into my yard, she crossed her arms and said, "Well, if you didn't want people to take, you shouldn't grow so much. It's practically community property." Community property? This is my yard, I pointed out. Well, the neighborhood is a community, isn't it? I thought you'd be a little more neighborly. She actually pouted as she said this, like she was scolding a child. I told her she was trespassing and that I'd call the police if she kept it up. She just laughed, told me to chill out, and shut the door in my face. I thought about letting it go, but then I remembered how often I've heard her harassing other neighbors over petty stuff. This time I decided to put my foot down. I installed a little fence around the garden and added a security camera. Sure enough, just 2 days later, I caught Karen in the act again. She saw the camera and immediately went red in the face. She stomped up to my front door, banging on it like a police raid. When I opened it, she started screaming about how I was invading her privacy with the camera and how I was being a terrible neighbor for not sharing my garden. She even threatened to report me to the HOA, which doesn't even exist in our neighborhood. I calmly told her that if she ever stepped onto my property again, I would send the footage to the police for trespassing. That shut her up, and she stormed off, muttering under her breath. The next morning, I found a new note. This one said, "I hope you enjoy being a miserable, greedy person. Don't expect me to be friendly anymore." Again with a smiley face. Since then, she's been giving me the cold shoulder, glaring at me whenever I'm outside, and ranting loudly to anyone who will listen about how selfish I am for not letting her have my vegetables. But hey, at least my tomatoes are safe. After the fence and the camera, I thought I was finally done with Karen's nonsense. But she's the kind of person who just can't let things go. It wasn't long before she upped her game. A few days later, I noticed that my trash cans, which I keep on the side of the house, had been knocked over. At first, I thought it was raccoons or something, but then I saw another note tucked under the overturned bin. It read, "Maybe if you weren't so busy spying on people, you'd take better care of your property." I couldn't believe she'd gone out of her way to tip over my trash. I ignored it, hoping she'd just give up. But of course, Karen doesn't know how to quit. About a week later, I was on my back porch having coffee when I heard Karen's voice through the fence. She was talking to another neighbor, loudly enough for me to hear. "I just don't know what's gotten into some people," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Imagine putting up cameras because you won't even share a few tomatoes. It's like living next to a prison." She kept going on and on about how unfriendly and paranoid I was, making sure her voice carried over to my yard. I tried to tune her out, but it got under my skin. I could hear the other neighbor making polite noises, clearly uncomfortable with the whole thing. But Karen just wouldn't shut up. At that point, I decided that if she wanted to escalate, I could play that game too. So, I put up a new sign in my garden, right by the fence where she could see it. It said, "Private property. Do not pick. Trespassers will be prosecuted." A little dramatic, maybe, but I wanted to make a point. The next day, I caught her red-handed again, this time trying to sneak into my garden while pretending to check something in her own yard. She saw the sign and turned beet red. She looked up at the camera, then at me as I watched from my window, and she stormed back into her house without saying a word. I thought that might finally be the end of it. But no, Karen is as persistent as a bad cold. 2 days later, I got a visit from a police officer. Apparently, Karen had called them, saying I was harassing her with the security camera and the sign, which she claimed was intimidating. I couldn't help but laugh when the officer explained the situation to me. Fortunately, he was reasonable and seemed to understand exactly what was going on. I showed him the footage of her sneaking around my garden and told him about the notes she'd left. He shook his head and told me not to worry about it. He said he'd talk to Karen and tell her to stay off my property. I watched from my window as he went over to her house and spoke with her for a good 15 minutes. Karen looked furious, her arms flailing as she talked, but in the end, she just shut her door without any more fuss. I thought that would finally teach her a lesson, and for a few days, things were actually quiet. I started to believe she'd finally given up. Then, one evening, I came home to find that my entire garden had been stripped bare. Every single tomato, cucumber, and pepper gone. The plants were still there, but all the vegetables had been picked clean. My first thought was Karen, but I didn't have any proof. I checked the security footage, and wouldn't you know it, somehow the camera had been turned around to face the wall. She must have found a way to sneak over and mess with it. I was beyond angry. It wasn't even about the vegetables anymore. It was the sheer nerve of this woman to keep pushing and pushing. I reported the incident to the police again, but without any footage or evidence, they couldn't do much. So I decided to get creative. I planted a new batch of tomatoes, but this time, I added a little surprise for Karen. I mixed in some extra hot ghost peppers with the tomato plants, the kind that you definitely don't want to bite into by accident. I even labeled the plants incorrectly, putting sweet tomatoes right on the pepper plants. Sure enough, about a week later, I heard a loud scream coming from Karen's backyard. I peeked over the fence and saw her running around, clutching a bright red ghost pepper in one hand and a glass of water in the other, her face turning bright red. She spotted me watching and immediately started cursing me out between gulps of water, accusing me of trying to poison her. I just shrugged and said, "What are you doing in my garden, Karen?" She didn't have an answer. She just stormed back into her house, still fuming, and I haven't heard a peep from her since. Every time I see her now, she just gives me a dirty look and hurries inside. Now, my garden is flourishing again, and the best part? Karen hasn't dared to touch a single plant. And if she ever does, well, let's just say I have a few more ghost peppers ready to go.